Right. Well, everyone, we are in for the first video of the month of February after a week pause slash break, whatever you want to classify it as. So, for the first video for this month, we're going to delve a little bit into a topic that I don't think I've covered nearly as much on this channel as I probably should, considering how much my own interest goes into it and considering how much there is an interest in general in the American Civil War. And coming kind of selecting topics. In the past, I've done one or two videos on the Civil War, but not really gone much more in depth. Two topics that I kind of come up upon recently that I wanted to go ahead here and maybe do a video on. Today, we're going to cover at least one of them. Depending on how I can formulate it, we'll do the other one next week, but it depends on how things can go. So, I wanted to talk more or less and take a look at two particular states in the American Civil War that I don't think the not that they're not talked about, but I think they're worth talking about because they have a very odd position in the war. That, of course, was border states that basically, if you're not familiar with the Civil War and what the border states are slave states, states that legally permitted slavery, that during the American Civil War did not secede from the Union. These slave states, although they had legal slaves, they did not join the Confederacy that was set up in the South by the 11 seceded states that tried to break away. So these states, in particular, they were the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. West Virginia comes in a little later during the middle of the war. Technically, you could also count. No, I mean they do count Delaware, but Delaware didn't have a very large population. So primarily, we're talking mostly about Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri and West Virginia to an extent, which we could look at how West Virginia comes out of that. I think that'd be very interesting to take a look at how that comes out of the Civil War. So maybe we will do that as a third one. But for the subject of today's video, we're going to go ahead here and take a look, particularly at the events that went on within the state of Kentucky during the Civil War. Both the two states I want to really take a look at here, of course, are Kentucky and Missouri, as both of them. If you ever looked at the Confederate flag, which I'm sure most people have an idea what that looks like, if you ever notice, there's only 11 official states that ended up seceding from the United States to join the Confederacy. However, if you look at the Confederate flag, there are 13 stars. Now, you might assume that has something to do with maybe the original 13 colonies. Well, it doesn't on the Confederate flag. Each star does represent a state, but not the original 13 colonies. Each star represents a state that the Confederate government claimed was part of the Confederate States of America. So then you might ask, well, why are there two more stars then? That is because the Confederate government, though Kentucky and Missouri never officially seceded, they were never officially under Confederate control. There were breakaway, little separatist little governments that tried to set up and declare informal secession for Missouri and Kentucky during the Civil War, and that is why the Confederacy would recognize the secession, but they never controlled a majority of the state. They were not the majority at all. They weren't the official government. It was like a shadow government, and they never really had any actual authority. But the Confederacy recognized them nonetheless. So, for the purpose of today's video, we're going to take a look at Kentucky. Now, for next week, I'm looking at maybe doing Missouri, and maybe we could also take a look at how West Virginia comes about, which I think would be something to look at with these border states because they really epitomize the house divided aspect of the Civil War. When we're saying that this was, brother against brother and family against family in some cases, these are the states that really really comes into reality because these states have both anti-slavery and pro-slavery factions within them. You have pro-Southern sympathies. You also have pro-Northern Unionist sympathies in both of these states. And in the border states in particular, the fight is just a lot more personal. And there's a lot more inter-conflict within these states over the Civil War. Now, Kentucky holds a uniqueness in the Civil War because it is the only state during the Civil War. It declared formal neutrality. Basically, it did not want either side to get involved and invade the state. But that eventually got violated, as we'll see. So again, we could go way into detail on some things, and I'm going to make this clear right now. We're just going to look at a general overview, not so much, I mean, we will mention some battles that end up happening and occurring, but we will not go like in depth because that is not the primary focus. We're just looking at the general events that were going on in these couple border states during the American Civil War, which I feel is worth taking a look at. So we'll look a little bit here at Kentucky before the Civil War, as the Civil War is coming up. So slavery had been in Kentucky ever since the state had been a territory of the United States. So prior to Kentucky even becoming a state, slavery had been introduced into what would become the state of Kentucky. Mind you, this was probably because a lot of the early settlers in Kentucky came from like the Carolinas and Virginia in particular, where slavery was already a common practice of life, and thus many of the settlers brought their slaves with them, brought the practice with them. No one really thought about anything back then. Mind you, this was the 18th century. The Kentucky was one of the first states to be created after the original 13 colonies all ratified the Constitution. Only the state of Vermont came in before. It was the 15th state of the United States to be admitted, of which Kentucky would become a state on June 1st. I believe it was June 1st of 1792. I know the year, I know the month. I just sometimes I get wrong on the date, but I'm pretty sure it's June 1st or it's June 2nd of 1792 that Kentucky ends up getting admitted to the United States and becomes the 15th state as a slave state. By 1830, 24% of Kentucky's entire population were actually made up of enslaved African Americans. Now, that total would drop to about 19.5% by the eve of the Civil War in 1860, but still, almost 20% of Kentucky's population was made up of enslaved persons. And in 1860, that actually ranked the third highest of any state in the nation. Only the states of Virginia and Georgia had higher populations of enslaved people. 57%, however, of Kentucky slave owners were not large plantation like down in the deep south where they could hold, many hundreds of slaves at times on these massive plantations that they had. Over half of these Kentucky slave owners owned four or fewer slaves. So they weren't large plantation growing, slave owners. Many of these just had a couple of personal slaves for the local farm, but it was still slavery nonetheless. Now Kentucky before the Civil War had divides occurring within it over the concept of slavery. Obviously, most states did. Of course, down south, they're more pro slavery because it's more entrenched. But Kentucky is in the weird position because it's kind of right in the middle. It's in what we call the upper south. It's not the deep south in Kentucky. And Kentucky is kind of in a unique position of being between this real south down. I mean, Tennessee is technically upper south too, but it's kinda in between the Deep South and the North. I mean, the Ohio River forms Kentucky's northern border, so it's right there at what is generally classified as the northern borderline of freedom for enslaved people. And Kentucky is no different. It was having divisions before that. Most of the ardent slavery supporters in Kentucky were from the southern and western portions of the state, which those portions of the state, their economies and the landscape of them mostly resembled that in the deep south. So it was understandable that slave owners would kind of concentrate in those two portions of the state, and thus there'd be more ardent supporters in those regions of continuing the practice. Now, a major difference in the agricultural economy of Kentucky was that if you go down to the Deep South, we all know that a main reason that slaves were so in high demand in the Deep South in the southern United States was the main cash crop was cotton. After the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s, cotton becomes the main cash crop in the Southern economy, and it is the main driver of increased reliance upon slavery, is because of the amount of cotton that needs to be grown in order to make a profit, and the amount that you can make in order money that you can be made just by picking it and then having it processed and baled off. And this was the major driver of slavery, especially in the Deep South. As we all know, cotton is king. In Kentucky, that is not at all the case. Cotton is not the main cash crop in Kentucky. Cotton does not grow well in Kentucky. It just does not have quite the right conditions. Instead, the main cash crop in Kentucky is still tobacco. Now, before the 1790s, tobacco had actually been a major cash crop in states like Virginia and the Carolinas, but by the 1790s, by the end of the 18th century, since tobacco had been planted since the first colonial settlers came to those regions, the soil was getting rather exhausted of that crop, and the yields were not as high, and thus Had the cotton gin not really come out, it's likely to suppose that slavery could have kind of died out shortly around after 1800, simply due to the fact that cotton wasn't really profitable and the main cash crops that they had needed slavery for before then weren't really producing the high yields that they had. And had that continued on that trend, it's likely slavery would have died out on its own. But since the cotton gin suddenly made this crop highly profitable, slavery instead explodes. But Kentucky was still relying upon tobacco. In fact, about roughly one fourth of the nation's tobacco back in 1860 was grown in Kentucky. Kentucky was the nation's leading producer of tobacco. And they would also grow things like hemp or marijuana. Marijuana was grown there, and they would also even grow, I think they might have had some indigo, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. But tobacco is the main crop, which is a major difference. And Kentuckians from the northern and eastern regions, they're more ideologically opposed to slavery. Now, the northern regions, it makes sense there because think the northern regions are right on the Ohio River. They're bordering like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. They're bordering states that slavery is already, it's illegal in those states. Those are free states. You can't have slavery is not existent there. And that is a major contributor as to why those areas are more ideologically opposed to slavery, plus the factor that their economies are starting to diversify in those regions. In the northern and eastern Kentucky, prior to the Civil War, those were the portions of the state that is starting to actually see some sort of industrialization, unlike much of the South. Mind you, a big contributor with the conflicts that come between North and South with the Civil War is the North is rapidly industrializing. They're becoming a main manufacturing power. They are the main manufacturing hub in the country. That was something that the South massively lacked and ultimately was a contributor to why it lost the war, is it really did not have an industrialized manufacturing capacity like the North did. The South is still relying largely on an agrarian economy based on agriculture and farming. It's not heavily industrialized yet. Not to say that there aren't areas. There were areas, of course, in Virginia. There were areas, I believe, down in New Orleans. And Kentucky is another exception to that. Kentucky, northern and eastern Kentucky, by the dawn of the Civil War, are starting to become industrialized to some extent, which is causing those regions to become less reliant upon the agriculture for their economies. They were moving toward cultivating grains and cereals, breeding livestock, and manufactured goods as a whole. By 1850, Kentucky actually held the second largest economic base in the entire Southern economy. And it was also becoming less reliant on slavery just before the Civil War started. As we mentioned, the population that was made up of enslaved African Americans had dropped by roughly 5% in just 30 years. Now, a third faction of Kentuckians, they were not really, they didn't own slaves themselves per se, but they also weren't opposed to it, as many of them classified it as a necessary evil, though many of them didn't actually participate in the practice, but they really didn't see any reason to mess with it either. So we'll call these the neutral party. They just, they don't care that it exists. They don't really have any opposition to it, even though they're not actually taking part in the practice. So Kentucky is a divided state before the Civil War even starts when it comes up to the topic of slavery. Now, as the secession crisis comes into effect after, and for anyone that needs a refresher or isn't all that familiar, Abraham Lincoln in 1860 wins the presidential election of that year in November. Now, Abraham Lincoln is elected on a platform. He is the first Republican president, and he is elected on the platform of basically opposing the expansion of slavery into the new territories out west that had been acquired from Mexico roughly 10 years before, after the end of the Mexican American War. Lincoln had already stated he had no intentions of messing with slavery where it already existed. He had no intentions of interfering with slavery in the slave states that were already in existence. Republicans were simply opposed to trying to contain slavery, the containment of it, and keep it from spreading to these new territories and any new states that might come out of it. Southerners, out of their own beliefs and their dependence upon the slavery for their agrarian economy, saw this as a threat to their livelihoods, saw this as a threat to, their way of life, and they assumed that, okay, well, Lincoln says this now, that means he's going to try to abolish slavery in general, which will then ruin our economy. And Southerners very rapidly become openly hostile to Lincoln getting the presidency. And in December of 1860, South Carolina is the first state to officially dissolve or try to secede from the United States, claiming that it's no longer part of it and is breaking its ties. By February 1st, there have been six more states that end up following, all of them deep South states, those of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas have all followed by February 1st of 1861. And then they come together in February in Montgomery, Alabama, and establish the Confederate States of America as this new Southern Republic that is pretty much identical. Its constitution is identical to the US Constitution, except for two main differences. One, it gives much more power to the individual state governments than the federal government. And two, it actually contained a direct clause that expressly protected the right and continued existence of slavery. And that was the two main differences. Now, Kentucky, when the secession crisis comes about, Kentucky becomes quite torn with its loyalties because you have many in Kentucky who are going to support the Union, while others are siding with their fellow Southern slaveholding states in the newly founded Confederacy. The governor at the time of Kentucky was a man by the name of Beriah Magoffin, and he was a pro Southern person in many of his sympathies at the time. Now, when the Civil War would actually break out, when South Carolinian Confederates fired upon the federal fort at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April of 1861, President Lincoln would request that Kentucky, like every other state that he was requesting at the time, supply help toward contributing toward the 75,000 volunteers that he was asking for the states to put forward in militia to help put down the rebellion. Governor Magoffin was quite adamant in his reply to Lincoln over the request that Kentucky contribute to sending those troops, and his reply that he sent over a telegram was the following: that I will send not a man nor a dollar for the wicked purpose of subduing my sister Southern states. Magoffin, being pro-Southern, was not about to send Kentucky militia into a war to the South to subdue what he viewed as sister states that he viewed simply had grievances. Magoffin was much more inclined that he thought Kentucky can kind of act as a mediator. We are a slave state, yes, but we're also not inclined to disunion yet. So maybe we could try to bridge the gap between the federal government and that of these seceded southern states and try to act as, a little bit of the medium in between them. Did that happen? No, it didn't. And McCoffin quickly found out that he was kind of by himself in this opinion. He was pro Southern and willing to help the Southern states out, but the majority of the population within his state was not. In May, there would be a convention of the Kentucky state legislature, which would adopt a proclamation of neutrality in May. Now, McGoffin had kind of not wanted to actually go to neutrality, as he kind of viewed, I'm very pro Southern. I want to help my Southern fellow Southern states out, but he did believe in respecting the will of the majority, the will of the people. And Magoffin did, even though he didn't personally want to go with the neutrality bid, he did, since the legislature had elected to do so, he went ahead and endorsed it despite his Southern sympathy. So Magoffin declares in May of 1861, Kentucky is neutral. We are declaring neutrality. The Confederate troops are not welcome in the state, but neither are federal troops. Neither side is to enter Kentucky, or we will view you as hostile. Both sides would initially respect Kentucky's neutrality, which was odd. They were the only state to declare neutrality at the outbreak of this conflict. Now, despite Magoffin's pledges to abide by the will of the people, many Unionists in Kentucky did not trust him. And in that June, just a month after the proclamation of Kentucky neutrality, the state elections that were held in June actually delivered large Unionist majorities in both houses of the Kentucky state legislature, which kind of would bind Magoffin should he try anything that was too pro Southern. And they also had enough votes to override any vetoes from him should he pass one. Now, Kentucky Unionists would mostly favor neutrality at the outbreak of the Civil War because many of them, while they did disapprove of secession and didn't think that it was constitutional, there were also many of them that also felt, you know, they also disapproved of the North's action toward the Southern states. They did believe that some of the coercion tactics that the North was using were uncalled for, and that was why they didn't really want to get involved in the fighting. You also had Confederate sympathizers within the state of Kentucky who did not want the state to get involved and were also for neutrality, but along entirely different lines. They believed that should Kentucky actually choose a side, it would more than likely choose that of the Union, and thus they did not want that happening, so they prefer Kentucky to stay neutral than rather be an enemy. Despite the state's neutrality, however, recruiters for both sides would enter the state and would actively try to recruit soldiers for both of their respective armies. The Confederates were one of the first to send Confederate recruiters into the state of Kentucky to try to recruit many Kentuckians to join up. The Federals would follow, and there were quite a few recruits on both sides. There were entire brigades on both the Union and Confederate armies that were made up of Kentucky recruits. While in the meantime, Union and Confederate armies would start amassing on the state's borders, waiting for events to kind of unfold and wait to see what was going to end up happening. So before we go much further here, I'll go ahead and bring that out. So here is an image of this was a Confederate recruitment ad that would have been posted in Kentucky during 1861 when they're trying to send these recruiters in to get men to sign up. This is an example of one of those ads. So Kentuckians to arms. This was one for the Confederates. And of course, looks like it was posted in Louisville, Kentucky. If you notice down there at the bottom, and we can read a little bit of it here. It says, Kentuckians rise, you have lain too long in a stupor deep, rise like young giants refreshed with sleep. Sweep as the billows shoreward sweep, and chase the foe to your boundaries. And of course, if you go further down, they do kind of end up mentioning more about, this is against the North in terms of Kentuckians strike, if needs must be, both swift and sore, scatter the Northmen from stream to shore, until panic stricken they come no more to see what our neutral soil is like. So this was just an example of one of the recruiting efforts that one of the two sides was making in Kentucky during 1861 as that's coming into light. And let me see here. Here we have an image of Governor Magoffin. So this is Governor Magoffin. So this is Beriah Magoffin. He was governor of Kentucky at the outbreak of the Civil War. He was very pro-Southern in his sympathies, but he did respect the legislature's choice to go and declare neutrality for the Commonwealth. He eventually would end up resigning the following year in 1862 and start casting his lot with the Confederacy. But after the war, he actually became a proponent of African American rights and even supported the 13th Amendment, which was quite a surprise. But he was a controversial figure when Kentucky declared neutrality due to his Southern sympathies. And here we have a political cartoon from that time, which is very interesting, basically depicting, you know, the recruitment, I think, the recruitment effort that was being made, because this is depicting it's criticizing Kentucky's neutrality, essentially, is what it is doing. So we have Magoffin, who is the cat here with the bourbon bottle, and he's holding the Union, the rooster, the cock of the flock, and he's holding him back while this cat, which is supposed to be Jeff Davis or the Confederacy, is killing the other chickens that are representing Unionists. Now, that doesn't mean he's killing Unionists, but I think it's more alluring to the factor that Magoffin is not wanting. His neutrality thing is kind of holding the Union back while the Confederates are openly sending recruiters at that point into what was supposed to be a neutral state. Excuse me. And that was something else. I mean, when we mentioned that Kentucky is divided, I mean, also taking into consideration some of the more famous people here. I mean, one of the oddest coincidences of the Civil War, if you really think about it, is the factor that both presidents of both of the two warring sides are native Kentuckians originally. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was a lifelong resident of Illinois, but he was born in Kentucky. He was born in Hodgesville, Kentucky in 1809, while his Confederate counterpart, Jefferson Davis, had also been born in Kentucky originally, even though he was a Mississippi senator at the time of the Civil War. So both of the two presidents were originally Kentuckians on both sides of the aisle, which was something that was definitely a little odd. And look at the great orator Henry Clay. Henry Clay had died in 1852, I believe. He was dead by the time the Civil War came, but it hadn't been long. And he had a number of sons, I believe, I can't remember if it was sons or grandsons. I believe he had at least three of them fought for the Union and another four fought for the Confederacy. They were splitting families. Also, mind you, that Mary Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife, she was originally from Lexington, Kentucky. She was born in Lexington, Kentucky. The Todd family was, and many of her brothers, so she had brothers and cousins who were fighting in the Confederate Army, which made her a target of ridicule in the North because she was suspected of having Southern sympathies, even though she was more than loyal to her husband and to the Union. But, it split households. Kentucky was split internally in family room just as much as it was politically. That was something that I don't think I mean, it did occur in other states, but Kentucky in the border states, like I try to say at the beginning of this, it was really, really exemplified in those border states, this conflict that is tearing the nation in two. So, President Lincoln, upon Kentucky's declaration of neutrality in May of 1861, he is very careful to leave Kentucky alone. Lincoln was actually quoted as having once said that he honestly believed that to lose Kentucky was to lose the war, was to lose the whole game if they lost Kentucky. So he was very careful to respect Kentucky's neutrality wishes. Now, he did order Union troops and Union armies to kind of shore up on the borders of Kentucky along the Ohio River in case the Confederates should make any kind of a move or the situation change. But he did order them to not, under any circumstances, go into the state of Kentucky. You are to respect their neutrality proclamation because he feared that any demonstration of force would push Kentucky into the arms of the Confederacy. He even would turn a blind eye for quite some time over the factor that horses, ammunitions, and supplies that were in Kentucky were slowly being ferried out and entering into the Confederacy, into the Confederate armies. The Unionist victories in the Kentucky state legislature would lead to Southern sympathizers in Kentucky actually organizing a resistance to them. And they would end up, now, this was after the neutrality got violated, but after Confederate forces were put on the back pedal in Kentucky, these Confederate Kentuckian sympathizers would end up trying to form this shadow government, this shadow Confederate government in November of 1861, centered at Bowling Green, Kentucky, in which the Confederate government would recognize in December of 1861 and thus claim, Kentucky's part of us, even though the shadow government had no real control over the state. It never did. And that was where the star for Kentucky came from on the Confederate battle flag was although the Confederate government recognized this shadow Confederate government of Tennessee, they never actually exercised any kind of political authority over it. And now, in September of 1861, Confederate forces under General Leonidas Polk would end up being the ones to violate Kentucky's neutrality. Polk would go ahead and enter Kentucky in September of 1861. He thought that the residents of the state just needed to be pushed into seceding. That if they, when the moment Confederates actually went into Kentucky, that he thought Confederate sympathies are so prominent in Kentucky that the people will flock to us. They'll be rising up to join us and it'll be the work of a week and the whole state will come and join us. That is not at all what happened. And in large part, you could claim that there is a line to be made from the Confederate invasion of Kentucky that violates Kentucky's neutrality and gets Kentucky into the Union camp. That there is a line to be made in that massive blunder to the invasion of Tennessee the following year, which is a direct consequence, and even to the loss of the Confederacy in the end. Because what does the invasion of Tennessee get them? They lose Tennessee. The Federals start going down the Mississippi River. They take Vicksburg by 1863 and cut the Confederacy in two. And then they're also heading into Georgia and burning through there. So you could make the argument that had I'm not saying that it, like, for certain did, but there could be a line to be made between the Confederate blunder of assuming that Kentucky would just go to them if they, showed force and went in person, and the ultimate outcome of the war, where that kinda didn't play out well for them. So in September, as we mentioned, Polk goes into Kentucky expecting that they'll be welcomed with open arms. And he goes into Kentucky and sees the town of Columbus on the Mississippi River, which is that small portion of Kentucky way over on the Mississippi. Union forces would then respond by seizing and occupying the town of Paducah, Kentucky, in order to counter the presence of the Confederates at nearby Columbus, which was a heavily fortified town. I believe in many cases it was known as, I can't remember if it was, I believe it was Columbus, but it could have been Paducah. But one of the two towns was actually termed as the Gibraltar of the West. It was just that heavily fortified. Now, since the Confederates had been the first ones to invade, they became the aggressor of Kentucky's neutrality. Now, Magoffin, with his pro Southern sympathies, he requested that both sides needed to leave the state, as he declared that both of them were in violation, which they technically were. I'm not going to defend the North in this instance. They were both in violation of Kentucky's neutrality. But the Unionist legislature basically overrode Magoffin's order and said that they requested that only the Confederates withdraw. They were okay with the Union troops being there since they had not been the first ones to actually make the move. Union soldiers would end up taking control of northern Kentucky, while Confederates from Tennessee would end up occupying the southern portion of the state in late 1861. The Cumberland Gap would become a vital point that would be occupied by Confederates under General Felix Zollicoffer, who was a man from Tennessee. The Cumberland Gap was most vitally important because it held many railroad lines that ran through it that connected to Unionist East Tennessee, which, as we covered back in the summer when I went out to Tennessee, East Tennessee was actually largely pro-Union and they were stuck in Confederate territory. So this was, a vital area that the Federals wanted to control, and they could not allow it to be in Confederate hands. On October 21st of 1861, Zollicoffer's Confederates were checked by Union forces at the Battle of Camp Wildcat, which would kind of force the Confederates to kind of, I wouldn't say fully withdraw from Kentucky, but it would force them to fall back a bit. Zollicoffer still desired to head north into Kentucky and gain more Confederate control within the state, but he instead went west and encamped at Mill Springs in November of 1861. In January of 1862, as the new year dawned, Union forces under General George Thomas would end up moving in to defeat Zollicoffer's Confederates at Mill Springs. They ended up defeating Zollicoffer and his compatriot General George Crittenden on January 19th of 1862 at the Battle of Mill Springs, and Zollicoffer ended up getting killed in that battle. He was the first Confederate general to die on the western theater of the war. And the remaining Confederates that were with Crittenden and him had then fled back into Tennessee and kind of abandoned going further into Kentucky. The Union victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February of 1862, which were accomplished by a young, well, I wouldn't say a young, but at that point, a relatively unknown Ulysses S. Grant, who would later, of course, become the main general of the Northern armies and later president, and those victories just across the border in Tennessee, like they were right on the Kentucky-Tennessee border in February, would force Polk's Confederates that were at Columbus to have to abandon Columbus, Kentucky to the Federals, realizing that they were in danger of getting encircled and in danger of being entrapped. So they had to abandon Columbus. And by early 1862, the Confederates largely withdraw, having been the first ones to violate Kentucky's neutrality, and now they end up being the ones that leave the state. And largely by the summer of 1862, Kentucky is in Union hands. There is no Confederate forces really within the state of Kentucky by that time. So the Federals have won the first big battle for Kentucky. They've pushed Confederates back out. So to go through here, and okay, we will refer to this map a couple times. I hate being able to not find a bigger map, but just to show you where Paducah is in Columbus, they're down in this portion of Kentucky. So here's where Paducah is. That is where that was. So down here is where Columbus and them would be. That is where the Confederates kind of hold out until after Zollicoffer's men end up getting defeated at Mill Springs, and then they kind of realize we're in danger of getting encircled, so they leave the state. Up here is where the other things that happen. So Zollicoffer comes in from here around the Cumberland Gap area. He gets checked at Camp Wildcat, which is, I believe it's this dot. Yeah, Camp Wildcat is about right there. That's where he gets checked in October of 1861. He then goes this way and encamps, I believe. Yep, he goes here a little bit to the, I think it'd be his west. Yep, be his west. And he goes here to Mill Springs. He camps there in November. In January, they get attacked. Zollicoffer ends up dying, getting killed in that battle, and then his remaining forces that are left end up retreating back into Tennessee. This other stuff hasn't happened yet, but we'll come back to that. So we will use that again. Here we have an image of Zollicoffer. So this was Felix Zollicoffer. He was a Tennessee man by trade, but he was the first Confederate general to end up being killed on the Western theater of the war. He was the one that led the initial Confederate movements along with Leonidas Polk into Kentucky and violated the state's neutrality, which kind of backfired because the Confederates were never welcomed with the open arms that they anticipated they were going to get in Kentucky. They never were welcomed to the degree that they thought. That was a major part of why that failed so quickly. Any of the other ones I want to show right now? I don't. Nope, not yet. So in August of 1862, so mind you, by early summer, Union forces have control of Kentucky fully under Union control. Well, the Confederates are not content to just leave Kentucky to the Union. They still believe they can take Kentucky and get it into Confederate hands. So in August of 1862, a new Confederate offensive that is launched under the command of two Confederate generals, two well-known Confederate generals. We have Confederate generals Braxton Bragg and Edmund Kirby Smith, who would end up again moving Southern troops into Kentucky in a second invasion of the state. They would move from East Tennessee. So I wouldn't say both of them. In the case of Smith, Smith moves from East Tennessee and ends up heading directly moving north and trying to take the objective of taking Lexington, Kentucky. That is what his primary objective is. And he starts moving up through the Cumberland Gap and heads up north through the I'm trying to think of what interstate it is now, but it runs right through Richmond, goes south from Lexington into Jellicoe, Tennessee. But that is the route that he ends up taking, not too far away from the defeat at Camp Wildcat back in the fall of 1861. So that is the route that Smith takes. As Smith and his troops near Richmond, Kentucky, they encounter Union troops there under the command of William Buell. And there are three separate engagements that end up being fought around the town of Richmond, Kentucky on August 30th of 1862. Smith's Confederates end up routing the Union in all three of those engagements, and which is their Union forces they encounter are largely fresh Union recruits. They're relatively green, they're untrained, and they end up capturing roughly about 4,000 prisoners in the process. Bragg, his compatriot in this offensive, who, of course, right now there's a whole controversy about the Fort Bragg naming thing. And to be honest, Braxton Bragg is one of the worst generals of the Civil War. He lost almost every single battle he was ever a part of. He's even a possible, I think there's even been a couple of historians who have made a direct line as to his defeats as part of the reason why the Confederacy failed and lost the war. Because some of his defeats were very costly. But Bragg enters Kentucky through another route. He uses the Louisville and Nashville Railroad and marches up toward Bardstown. He does not take the Cumberland Gap route that Smith had used just about a couple weeks prior. And he ends up going into Kentucky and getting pursued by a large Northern Union force under the command of General Don Carlos Buell. And they would end up meeting in early October outside the town of Perrysville, Kentucky. And on October 8th, the Battle of Perryville would end up occurring, in which Bragg would order an attack on, at the time, what he thought was a much smaller Union force. He didn't have the full picture yet of how large Buell's force was that was in front of him, and he decided, oh, this will be easy to win. We'll crush him here. So he launches his attack on October 8th at Perryville. The initial success that the Confederates get is very quickly later reversed as the Confederates kind of realize, oh crap, we're outnumbered and we drastically messed up, to put it bluntly and in simple terms. Because, as I mentioned, Bragg did not do his homework before he went into this battle. He did not scout as he should have. He didn't, get proper reports of the enemy positions. And of their army numbers, so he kind of went into this and messed himself up. Bragg would end up retreating from the Battle of Perryville. The Union forces would win the Battle of Perryville, and he ended up withdrawing from Kentucky entirely just a week later after the loss there, to be well. Later, not because he had been destroyed, but because he was fearing encirclement and being destroyed entirely. So, thus, only a week after losing the Battle of Perryville in October of 1862, Bragg decides, yep, I'm abandoning this campaign. Back to Tennessee. And without him being there, of course, Smith doesn't really stay either. Smith ends up kind of pulling out as well because he can't do it by himself. He can't just keep pushing on to Lexington on his own. So here is a couple last images that we have here for this one. So here we have an image. This is the two Confederate generals that were in charge of the second Confederate invasion of Kentucky in the late summer, early fall of 1862. So here is General Edmund Kirby Smith. He would later also be the last major Confederate general to surrender in the Civil War in June of 1865. He was head of operations in the Western Theater by the end of the war. He leads the charge up from the Cumberland Gap going toward Lexington. He's the one that comes into conflict around Richmond, Kentucky, trying to push up that way. He's a lot more successful than Bragg in many respects. And then here we have our neighborhood idiot. This is Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg was born in North Carolina, but he was a Tennessee by birth. Well, not by birth, but by his living circumstances. He had lived in Tennessee for some time. Bragg goes in, he tries to come up through Bardstown. He meets Buell's forces at Perryville and massively miscalculates his move there and ends up withdrawing only a week later. He's not a good general. Not a good general. And he has a much further track record. It's not just Perryville, it's almost every single battle he was a part of. Not to say he didn't get a win every once in a while. I believe he did get one or two. I believe he, if I'm not wrong, I believe he was partly at Chickamauga, but I'm not 100% sure on that one, which was a Confederate victory later later on. And here we have Don Carlos Buell. Buell had also been present at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862 with General Ulysses S. Grant, which ended up being a Confederate surprise attack in the morning that was rapidly turned around by the Federals at a bloody cost, of course, and turned around on them. But Buell was the one that beat Bragg at Perryville in Kentucky. He was the one that had kind of pursued him up to that point. Bragg turns around, thinks, oh, this guy, there ain't so many troops as I think, and then Buell kind of outsmarts him. And then here is a depiction of the Battle of Perryville in October of 1862, as it was shown in the old Harper's Weekly magazine back in during the war. This was an illustration of the Battle of Perryville that ended up happening between Bragg and Buell in that second invasion of Kentucky, which is probably the most significant battle, I think, to come out of Kentucky. The whole Civil War, I think, was the Battle of Perryville. There might have been a second Battle of Perryville. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that there might have been a second one, or at least near that site. But that was the big battle that ended the second Confederate invasion of the state. So after Bragg's retreat from Kentucky and Smith kind of following him, the state would remain largely in Union hands for the entire remainder of the war. The Confederates never seriously threatened Kentucky again after the fall of 1862. Now, not to say that they were entirely immune from any kind of action. There were plenty of Confederate raiders who were riding up into Kentucky in order to try to create chaos and havoc behind Union lines, particularly by hurting Union supply lines and then looting and taking stuff back for the Confederate war effort. Among the most notorious was probably the Confederate raider John Hunt Morgan, who would launch multiple raids into Kentucky. His most successful raid, I believe, was his Christmas raid of 1862, which would see Morgan's raiders tear up over 20 miles of railroad track behind Union lines in Kentucky, and they would also proceed to destroy roughly $2 million in supplies and take about 1,900 prisoners in the process. Future raids by Morgan were not as successful, most notably one that he did in 1863 during the summer that ended up going up not just into Kentucky, but into Indiana and even Ohio, where he ended up getting captured. Those did not really go up so well, but that Christmas raid of 1862 is probably one of the more devastating ones that he did. When the war ended in April of 1865, Confederate Kentuckians kind of defied the federal government. They still were being very defiant after the war had ended. They were trying to resist, reconstruction efforts that were being made, even though the state had not seceded. They openly resisted the new changes that are coming through with the closure of the war. So the federal government ends up declaring that Kentucky. So the government rapidly kind of concludes, okay, the violence in Kentucky that's ensuing after the end of the war Yeah, we're gonna declare martial law because of that. So Kentucky ends up going into martial law for about 5 months after the end of the Civil War, and the state ultimately, when the 13th Amendment got passed in February of 1865, it actually rejected the 13th Amendment, even though enough states ratified it outright to get it passed anyway. But Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment officially, I believe, until like the 1970s, I think it was, that they actually ratified it. So Kentucky, even though it had been a Unionist border state that had slavery, it didn't want to abolish slavery altogether, and it had opposed the 13th Amendment when it came about. In all, in total, roughly 100,000 Kentuckians would serve in the Union Army during the war. 24,000 of them, well, not 24,000 of them, but later, an additional 24,000 African Americans, free African Americans from Kentucky, would also serve once colored regiments began to be made. And there were also about 20 to 40,000 Kentuckians who would end up serving in the Confederate armies, which I can draw a personal relationship to because I have two ancestors of mine along my ancestry. I have four Civil War veterans in my ancestry. Two of them were Ohio natives that fought for the Union, and two of them were Kentucky natives who ended up fighting in Confederate units. One of them was in the 13th Kentucky Cavalry Unit, and he ended up actually getting killed in 1864 during the war. At what battle? I've not yet determined that yet. I can't seem to find where they mention where he died or if it was even in a battle. It could have been a disease or something else, but he ended up dying during the war while serving in a Confederate cavalry unit. That was a Kentucky regiment, well, Kentucky one. So displaying that even though they were in a state that had not seceded, they did join the Confederacy. So yeah. So as I said, not that we're going for like in depth, but I wanted to take just like a general overview of this because I think it's something take worth taking a little interesting look at, given the unique position that Kentucky has during the Civil War. And that's the same reason why I think we're going to also take a look at Missouri, why we're possibly even going to take a look at West Virginia, how that even comes out, because West Virginia is actually created from Virginia during the Civil War. It's the only state to have been created from another state, which it still holds that distinction to this day. So, like I said, not the most detailed, but something I wanted to take a unique look at. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any further information that I did not mention, but maybe they know or whatever, feel free to put it in the comments section. Especially if anyone, I mean, native Kentuckians probably know much more than I could possibly know in a heartbeat. But if anyone's got any interesting stories, feel free to put that in there about Civil War in your local backyard. If you live in Kentucky or ever lived in Kentucky or whatever. So any of that in the comments section. And as for next week, we will plan on looking at a video for Missouri, at the history of Missouri with the Civil War. We'll see how that actually turns out. But as of right now, that's what I think we'll plan for. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week or weekend going into the weekend. And we'll see you all back here when that next video comes out.